So let me ask you to introduce yourself. Cindy, why don't you start?
My name is Cindy Kistenberg. I am a professor of communication and theater at Johnson C. Smith University, where I also serve as the advising coordinator for the College of Arts and Letters, where I have been for 15 years now.
Great. And Rabbi Class?
Rabbi Dusty Class. I am the associate rabbi at Temple Beth El here in Charlotte, and I've been here 4.5 years now. And I've also been a rabbi for 4.5 years now.
Great. And thank you once again for joining in this conversation today. I'm sure that some of my questions will be very naive, very goy. So I
schooled him.
So apparently he's got all the right words.
Please excuse me if my questions seem silly or but I just wrote down a bunch of questions that occurred to me as I was thinking about this conversation today. So first of all, Cindy, you grew up in a conservative community, right? So tell me about what it was like. Tell me about your experience growing up in a conservative Jewish home.
Well, conservative is a more traditional approach to Judaism than, say, where I am right now in terms of my Judaism, which is more Reform. And Rabbi, please correct anything I say that is incorrect. My mother was Orthodox, grew up Orthodox, which meant they more strictly followed the 613 mitzvot, which Rabbi Klaus can certainly handle better than I can. And my father didn't grow up in a very religious household, but when you grow up in New York, you were surrounded by Jewish people. But my grandfather was very religious. So my dad and my mom, when we moved to North Carolina, went conservative.
You split the difference.
Yeah, split the difference right there in the middle. The joke back in the family was that mom kept kosher, but my dad was so skinny and 6'4", like 145 pounds, they decided not to keep kosher so he could eat hamburgers and milkshakes and put more weight on him. That was the joke that I heard. I don't know if it's true, but hey, whatever. Growing up conservative in the South in the early 70s was tough because unlike my female relatives in New York, we were getting bat mitzvah. None of my female relatives in New York did that. And it involved, especially in 6th and 7th grade, a lot of days of Hebrew school and Sunday school, learning Hebrew, learning the prayers, and not being able to do anything else. So it was the most strict Judaism you could have in Greensboro, North Carolina in the early 70s. And I will admit that I was incredibly resentful most of the time. But as we all say, growing up, I'll never do this to my children. And then you grow up and you realize that you appreciate everything they did and they made you do. And fortunately, my son did not turn out to have as negative feelings about it. And I think probably it had to do with the teachers I had back then. I mean, back then, some of the Hebrew school teachers we had, really rigid and strict, and it wasn't as fun. They didn't make it fun. And now education is so much more fun across the board. So that was my experience. And now I am a member of Temple Beth El, Rabbi Klaus's temple. And one of the differences, and this is probably a great example and something that has taken a lot of getting used to, in our temple, in our synagogue growing up, you couldn't play music. You didn't have videos. You didn't take pictures. Nothing went on from sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday night because we adhered to the no work on Shabbat. There was somebody who was not Jewish who turned on the lights, who made sure we had the food there. We couldn't do any of that. It's a big adjustment when you go to a Reform temple because they play music. You've got video. It's really different and unique.
Talk to me about, I'm assuming you grew up Reform?
I did. Not always an assumption for people who end up in the Reform movement, clearly. Even I'd say in the rabbinic world, there are folks who grow up in the conservative movement that wind up in the Reform rabbinate. There are folks who grow up in the Reform world that end up in the conservative rabbinate. There are very few who end up in a modern Orthodox space. And I'll say, just because it's one of my soapboxes, that the way that I tend to define kind of the spectrum is that that Reform is no more or less traditional or religious, but the spectrum has to do with halacha, with observance of Jewish law. So more halachically observant is kind of how I would define it, which is such a mouthful that no one ever uses it. But the idea is that if you live in an Orthodox world, you are very halachically observant. You believe that the way to do Jewish well in the world involves following God's mitzvot, all of the commandments. And in the Reform world, we kind of understood two kinds of commandments at a base level: ritual commandments and ethical commandments. So ritual commandments are like light Shabbat candles, don't mix milk and meat. This is when you celebrate this holiday. Don't work on Shabbat. The ethical commandments are things like love your neighbor as yourself. Do not stand idly by while your neighbor bleeds. Pay a worker his wages before the next morning. All of these things that have to do with how you treat other people in the world. So the Reform movement decided back in the late 1800s, when the Reform movement was born, that the ethical commandments are timeless and binding, that no matter what, we always have a obligation to treat our fellow humans as if they are the like godly beings that we all are, but that the ritual commandments were written down 3,000 plus years ago and have been adapted over time and can continue to be adapted. And so in the Reform world, there's a whole category of law that isn't binding. Now, it not being binding does not mean theoretically entirely ignored, right? The catchphrase in Reform Judaism is choice through knowledge, which is this idea that you learn all the reasons behind all of the rules, and then you figure out which of those reasons and which of those rules make sense in 21st century America or wherever you are in the world. So the idea of not working on Shabbat turning into not driving on Shabbat, turning into not turning on a light switch on Shabbat, turning into these things, right? Like that is one interpretation of how people have interpreted don't work on Shabbat. That can be interpreted entirely differently and not have anything to do with electricity, but may mean like not opening your work email on Shabbat or whatever, right? Like that's the Reform understanding of things, is to say the rule might say don't light a fire, but if cooking is your happy place and you only get to cook on the weekend, like light a fire and instead don't do the thing that's going to make you stressed out on Shabbat, because Shabbat at its most basic is a day of rest. So what does it mean to create space for rest? Let's do that. That's my tangent on kind of like what Reform Judaism means. I grew up in Seattle, Washington. My mom is Catholic and my dad is Jewish. He was raised in Iowa in a conservative household as well. And in some ways you might say they also split the difference. They decided to raise Jewish kids. And my mom was really committed. They were both really committed to raising Jewish kids. And my mom maintained her Catholic practice. Neither of them were really practicing when they got married. And as happens very often when people get married, all of a sudden, all of the I'll figure out the religion later becomes really sharp in focus as soon as you have kids that you have to do something with religiously. So they maintain a very Jewish household. We were at Friday night services every single week from the time I was 0 until I was about 15 years old. And they decided I had enough of a Jewish identity that they weren't confused. They weren't concerned I would get confused. And in that time, my mom also started going back to church and got really involved in her parish. And so she would come with us to Friday night services, and she dropped us off on Sunday mornings at religious school, and then she went to mass, and then she picked us up, and then on Tuesday night when she went to Bible study. And it gave me a really clear sense of Kip, what you said about silly questions. There aren't any, and there aren't any, even if all of us in the room were Jews, even if all of us grew up in the same congregation. What each of us experience as human beings means that we each have a different understanding of everything. So when I'm leading anything at all, one of the greatest gifts my mom gave me is the gift of knowing that there's always going to be somebody in the room who didn't have the exact same experience that I had growing up. and that explanation is always helpful, even for people who have spent their entire lives like deeply within the Jewish community.